Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of the critical period to federalism. Our questions think about what were the major issues in the debate over the ratification of the Constitution? How did the creation of the Bank of the United States expose a debate over the interpretation of the Constitution? Contrast the powers of the national government under the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution using Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion to illustrate the differences. Once the delegates had completed the draft of the new constitutions, the next step was to get it approved. Recognizing that a very small number of people had helped to create this new system of government, they knew that they needed more widespread support. So Article 7 of the Constitution explains how the Constitution would be approved and go into effect. And this involves state ratifying conventions. People would vote for delegates to go to these conventions to debate the Constitution and then ultimately to approve it or reject it. So as each state debated whether to adopt the new Constitution, those who supported it called themselves Federalists, but those who opposed it were called anti-Federalists. One of the biggest issues related to this debate is the power of the new national government. The Federalists believed it was necessary to make the national government superior to the states, to make the Constitution the supreme law of the land. The anti-federalists, on the other hand, were concerned about this much more powerful national government. And even for those who felt like it was necessary for this new national government to have some additional powers, what they were concerned about is that nowhere in the Constitution was there a clear expression of the rights of the people. So what ends up happening is several states approve the Constitution immediately, but in other states, there are really serious debates, and New York was one of those states. So James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay publish a series of essays that came to be known as the Federalist Papers. And what's interesting about these is they are trying to convince the people of New York to approve the Constitution by explaining it. So this is one of those great moments where we have some insight into what were the people who created the Constitution thinking. And the other thing is that they're trying to disperse the fears that people had about the possibility that the new national government would be too powerful. And then ultimately, in New York, it was agreed that they would approve the Constitution if a Bill of Rights was added. So the Bill of Rights are designed to be a clear expression of the people's rights. And so what James Madison did is he collected the ideas for a Bill of Rights, and then during the first session of Congress proposed 12 amendments to the Constitution that would clearly express the rights of the people. 10 of those amendments were approved and then ratified by the states. So the first 10 amendments are the legacy of the anti-federalists, and they are the Bill of Rights. When you take a look, for example, at the First Amendment to the Constitution, you can see how the rights of the people are protected. The way it's worded, the amendment number 1 says, Congress shall make no law. So right there, it's putting a limitation on the power of the federal government and protecting the rights of the people. So jumping ahead to 1791, George Washington has been elected as the first president of the United States, and he has selected his cabinet, including the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton of New York. Alexander Hamilton has a particular vision for the United States. He is a true Federalist. He believes that the national government is superior to the states, and he wants to see the United States become an economic powerhouse like Britain. And so in order to do that, in January of 1791, Alexander Hamilton proposes a series of reports for Congress to consider. And one of those things was the establishment of a Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton believes that the bus is necessary because we needed some kind of centralized system within the financial sector to ensure that the United States could grow economically. I mean, when we think about banking in the 18th century or even into the 19th century, it's kind of the Wild West. And Hamilton wants to provide a stabilizing force, and he believes that the Bank of the United States could do just that. Congress agrees, and so Congress passes the bill that creates the bus. But when that bill reaches President Washington's desk, he's a little bit concerned because nowhere in the Constitution does it explicitly give Congress the power to create a bank. President Washington is very aware of how his administration is establishing a precedent, that he is establishing the traditions for the future of the United States. And he doesn't want to be violating the Constitution right out of the gate. But Alexander Hamilton convinces him that this is appropriate, that this is not outside of the boundaries of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton represents what we consider to be the loose constructionist view. This is a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And what Alexander Hamilton points to is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So Article 1 deals with Congress, and specifically Section 8 deals with the powers of Congress. So when you take a look at that section, it's quite large. It talks about all of the things that Congress can do, like coin money, establish post offices and post roads, establish and maintain a navy, those kinds of things. And at the very bottom is the so-called necessary and proper clause. And it basically says that Congress has the power to do those things that are necessary and proper to carry out those foregoing powers. So in order to do the things that Congress has some wiggle room in the Constitution. And what Alexander Hamilton points to are these so-called implied powers. So if Congress is going to borrow money on the credit of the United States or to coin money or collect taxes, then wouldn't it be necessary and proper for the United States government to have a bank? Washington was convinced, and he signed the bill into law. On the flip side of this are the strict constructionists, and they are offering a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And basically, this boils down to the Constitution doesn't say anything about a bank. And if it doesn't explicitly give that power to Congress, we don't have it. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison represent this strict interpretation. Even though James Madison was a Federalist, he doesn't want the federal government to stretch the Constitution because he fears the Constitution could be stretched out of proportion. So this difference between explicit powers that are stated directly in the Constitution or those that could be implied. The Bank of the United States is just one example of when this debate happens. In 1794, we end up with an interesting moment. One of the other things that Alexander Hamilton had proposed is an excise tax on whiskey. An excise tax is a tax on a manufactured product, and whiskey is a manufactured product because whiskey does not grow on trees. In 1794, a group of farmers in western Pennsylvania protested this federal excise tax on whiskey because this is one of the few ways that they were able to really make money. Farmers grew grain, and transporting grain was expensive because grain is bulky. So what a lot of the farmers did is they distilled their grain into whiskey, which has a higher profit margin. And so nobody likes to pay taxes, but this felt like personally offensive to the farmers. And so they rebelled. In the summer of 1794, a mob of about 500 rebels burned down the house of the federal tax collectors, and others destroyed the stills of those who voluntarily paid the whiskey tax. Because the Republican governor of Pennsylvania refused to suppress the angry farmers, President Washington saw this not only as a rebellion against the authority of the state of Pennsylvania, but a rebellion against the authority of the United States. And that was something that President Washington was simply unwilling to accept. So in that summer of 1794, President Washington gets on his horse and personally leads 12,000 militiamen to suppress the rebellion. Now, fun moment here. Once President Washington and the militiamen get to Western Pennsylvania, there's no rebellion happening. And some of the anti-Federalists were sort of poking fun at Washington and the other Federalists by saying, there's no rebellion. This is embarrassing for you. And I disagree with that, because what this shows is the fact that the new United States government has the power to defend its own authority. And that was something that the national government didn't have under the Articles of Confederation. So coming back to our questions to think about, what were the major issues in the debate over the ratification of the Constitution? And it really came down to, how do we make sure that the rights of the people are protected? So the Federalists are arguing in favor of a much more powerful national government. The anti-Federalists oppose that because many are concerned that the rights of the people are not protected. And then, of course, we settled that issue with the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. And then, how did the creation of the Bank of the United States expose a debate over the interpretation of the Constitution? Strict instructionists felt like the bus was unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't say anything about a bank. And if the Constitution doesn't say it, we can't do it. On the flip side, Alexander Hamilton and many of the loose constructionists argued that there are implied powers within the Constitution. And he points to Article 1, Section 8, the so-called necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause that stretches like your comfy pants. Contrast the powers of the national government under the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution using Shays's Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion to illustrate the differences. Under the Articles of Confederation, that's when Shays's Rebellion happens. And the Confederation Congress didn't have the money to organize an army to put down the rebellion. So the Confederation government didn't have the power to defend its own authority. Under the Whiskey Rebellion, however, with the Constitution, President Washington personally leads a group of militiamen to put down the rebellion. So under the Constitution, it's very clear that the new national government is powerful enough to defend its authority.